So let me emphasize show versus tell. If you can show all of this rather than tell it, it's going to work. All right? It's going to work much better. And we're going to talk about strategies for showing versus telling. And we will get into like how I design magic systems and how I do this stuff in a minute. But you can probably do this, okay? You guys are smart. You guys are clever. You know how to do this. And we'll talk about, advanced strategies for doing it. But what you don't know how to do is make it interesting. And that's what our focus is. So, one way to do it, dialogue is inherently more interesting to the reader than description. You can definitely go too far on this one, but if it's something you can have a conversation about and work into a conversation incidentally, then it's going to be great. It's going to be stronger. Great is the wrong term because you may not do it very well. But it's going to be stronger than if you've done it the other way. The difficulty of this is what we call Maid and Butler. This is a screenwriting term. Someone who's heard of this term, I know several of you have taken my class. Explain it to us. Who wants to do it? All right, right here.
Where you have the maid or the butler explain what's happening without the narrator do it, but essentially they fill the same role.
Yeah, back in the 1900s, or 19th century, 1800s, they would have plays where they would start the play off with the maid and the butler walking onto the stage, and the maid would say, "As you know, the master is away this weekend." And the maid would say, "Yes, I do know that." And the butler, "As you know, or did you know that the mistress is having the gardener into," they just go on this big thing, so you'd set up the whole story, and then the story would go. This looks very fake on the page, and this is one of those cues that when readers are like bored or not invested in the character, it's inherently out of character. It's doing the opposite job of in-character sort of exposition is doing. It is pulling you away from the character because it's giving you the kind of instinct that, wow, these characters must be idiots if they have to talk about this again. This thing that they obviously should know automatically. All right? So, Maid and Butler, you got to stay away. But dialogue is going to generally be a better way to approach this. A lot of stories, you don't want your books to be full of dialogue, but dialogue is good. Another way is in-character thoughts. If your character meets a new person and you want to describe that person as a show instead of a tell, and here's one for you. You can say, "Man, I hate redheads." If the character thinks that in their head, then suddenly you have said, "This other person is a redhead," rather than saying, this person was a redhead. And why is that one better? Why is it better to say, "Man, I hate redheads"? Not that we actually do. Don't hate on the gingers too much. Well, let's talk this through. Yeah.
Well, because you both characterize the person who's saying that, and you give a description of the situation.
Yes. You're doing two things. And how many words is it? A couple of words. Yeah.
Going along with conflict, you establish some type of conflict between the characters, not just giving information about the world, but now you have this thing between these two people you've just met.
Yeah.
And also you're letting the reader act, you're letting them make an assumption based on what you've written,
yep,
rather than force-feeding them. They say, "Ooh, I figured that out, I made the connection."
Right. And there's emotion in it. There's emotion, there's a sense of conflict, there is inherent story in the line, "I hate redheads." There is not inherent story in the lines, "He was a red-headed, lanky man." Now, sometimes you just want to write, "He was a red-headed, lanky man," right? That's fine. You don't want to do this. Nobody can do this all the time. But if you're looking for shows versus tells, this is the sort of thing you can do, all right?
There are also sometimes you might have a reader that says, "Oh, I don't like redheads either."
Right, you might.
I like this guy.
I'm hoping that if the character says that, you're establishing that the character is either unsympathetic or has room to grow or is sarcastic. But some people do. So it depends on the tone of the character you're writing. You're giving us character. That's why that is a show versus a tell. Usually physical actions, what we call beats, along with dialogue, are ways to show emotional state. If someone is pacing as they talk, it says something different about them than if they sit, lean back, stare up, and then say the same thing. Again, this is easy to overdo, okay? Keep in mind, we're talking about tools you can use to give some shows here and there. The ideal thing that I would want you to practice doing is to try and have a dialogue sequence where you've got dialogue, 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 and then like right here, you've got one really great sentence that evokes some description and some world building and some character. And then, more. And then over here, you've got, a paragraph that's like 2 sentences of really powerful. You've packed a lot of world building and things into those sentences. And then, more of that and things like this. That's a much stronger way to start a story with that sequence of dialogue. It doesn't even have to be dialogue. It can be description. But one of the things I talk about if you want to practice this is, think about who your character is. Think about what they're passionate about. We'll do a whole lecture on characters, maybe several of them, and try to say, in this scene, how can I do my descriptions in a way that we see through the character's eyes? So the other one is just description through a lens. Lens, sure. Description through a lens. This means that you stick us in the character's head. You're going to do this either in first person or you're going to do it in third person. Those are your 2 options. Don't use omniscient unless you really know what you're doing. We'll talk about that later. If you looked at me and you're like, omniscient, then don't. All right? All right? No omniscient unless you really know what you're doing. You got to wow me with omniscient. You're going to do first or you're going to do third. Limited. And you're going to describe a scene. Go home and try this. Say, okay, here are my 3 characters. Here's a room that I'm sitting in. How are the 3 characters going to describe this room differently? There are writers that I like that do a very good job of this. In The Wheel of Time, various characters would look at a cup of water and describe it very differently because of the cultural backgrounds they have. You can evoke cultural background by how you mention a cup of water. This is the sort of stuff that you really want to be doing, the description through a lens. This is the idea where I was talking about earlier, how the character is what people are reading the story for, and the setting, which is awesome, which is why they picked up your book probably instead of another book. If you can do it incidental to character, you will be more successful. If you can evoke the world instead of saying, a bunch of dock workers of this strange race were down there doing this, if you can have the character look at them and be scared because they haven't met this race before, or to be fascinated because, or to be, taking notes, or however it is that they do, or to not even notice them until they bump into them. All of these are different personalities for characters, and allow your character to drive your descriptions. You still want to put the descriptions in, but you want to break them up, and you want to have them through the lens of the character's eyes. All right? And you want to tend to focus your story on the areas where the character is going to have conflict and the story is going to have conflict. So this is our next big thing. So this guy, this is really important, okay? If you take nothing else home today than this, learn how to do this. Learn how to try and evoke setting through character or plot eyes, all right? But we are going to talk about focusing your story, all right? World building is awesome. And the longer your book is, if you're writing epic fantasy, you got more room for it. That's good. You want to avoid world builder's disease, all right? World builder's disease is where you sit and you plan your setting for 17 years before you write your book. What's that? Pat Rothfuss. It worked for him, didn't it? Here, I'm going to give you a gummy bear. You don't have to eat it.
Erickson was the same way.
Yes, Erickson was the same way. Tolkien was actually the same way. I'm forgetting to throw these out. Tolkien was the same way. The issue with this is, I should phrase it this way. You want to avoid world builder's disease unless it's what you want to do. Don't fall into world builder's disease accidentally, all right? And if you'll talk to Pat right now, Pat has rewritten each of his books from scratch after he sold the trilogy, which was done. Okay? That's because world builder's disease is actually going to be less useful to you than you probably think it will be. All right? You want to try and build a story, a world building. You want a world build appropriate to the story you're trying to tell. Maybe you want to spend 17 years and come up with this awesome thing. If you do, you are welcome to do that. However, it's really hard to make a living as a writer doing that, okay? And once you actually sell that magnificent book that you've spent 17 years on, you're going to have to write another one. And that's hard if you've spent, if you've done all of this. You will have to learn one way or another to become a working writer. Writers write at different speeds. This doesn't mean that each of you need to be Isaac Asimov and writing 4 books a year, which he did for a large part of his career. You don't need to do that. You can be the person that spends 2 years or 3 years writing a book. That's all right if you're writing big epic fantasies or big thick science fictions. Don't do that if you're writing urban fantasies and they're little. That means you're just not writing enough. But you can do that, but you got to be aware of the issues caused by it. My goal is to teach you to be working writers. And in that respect, I would suggest that you look at all of this stuff. Maybe keep a list of all the cool things that can happen in your world. All the cool things that someday you may even want to explain. And circle a few of them for a given novel and say, all right, case system's important. Languages, everyone's going to speak Galactic Common. Religion's important. Race relation, no, we're just going to use humans. But to these people, food culture is really important. I've studied food culture. We're going to do a foodie fantasy novel, also known as Game of Thrones. But you guys shouldn't laugh. You shouldn't be reading those books. No, I'm just joking. He is a fantastic writer, but they are very brutal, and I will warn that they have a strong content warning. I could only read one of them, and after that, I was like, okay, I know how good a writer he is. I don't want to be subjected to him doing this to me anymore. George R. R. Martin. Food culture. You're really interested in food culture, so you are going to write your foodie fantasy novels, and food is related to religion somehow. Well, hey, we've already got some cool mix of familiar and strange, don't we? Food culture and religion in a fantasy world. There's a story there somewhere. That's a nice mix. And a lot of times, familiar and strange, the way to get the strange is to blend 2 familiar things, right? This is a cool way. This is why in Hollywood everyone describes their stories as this meets this. You ever heard that? This is Shogun meets Breakfast Club. It's because you take 2 familiar things and you put them together, and people are like, "What? Samurais in detention? What?" It suddenly makes them think, and so this meets this. By the way, New York editors do not like Hollywood pitches like that. Just FYI. But mixing 2 familiar things to create a strange thing is a decent way to come up with a story. I doubt this is how he did it, but Ender's Game is an underdog sports story in space, right? Space is familiar, underdog sports story is familiar, Hoosiers in space becomes Ender's Game. And so you blend 2 familiar things and make a strange thing. So we've got this cool thing with different castes and different religions are allowed certain foods, and certain foods then have certain cultural whatnots and things like that. So spend your world building on these things. The other things are interesting, but come up and focus your efforts on making these interesting, all right? You can ask yourself these other questions. It actually won't take that long. You can spend a week asking yourself these questions and writing out a little thing for each of them. But what I'm saying with these is, I want a few of these things to be unique in your book. I want, as a reader, when I pick them up, and you've got your cool food culture thing with religion, I want to say, I've never seen that before. That's pretty cool. And I want to do that in every fantasy or science fiction book I pick up. And the ones that get published tend to do this. There's this great book a few years ago called Spellwright. which did this with a magic system and kind of this weird computer programming / language thing, which was pretty cool. 100,000 Kingdoms by N.K. Jemisin did this very well in the first opening pages. You will find new breakout stories frequently are doing stuff like this. You will read the first chapter and something about this cultural setting mixed with some physical setting or whatnot that's creating conflict is really interesting. This is what I mean when I said you guys don't do this enough, is I pick up too many stories that the setting is bland. That there is not one of these things or two of these things that's shining. That there's like a sentence in your head about each of them, rather than having 3 that are awesome to draw my attention. It's this sort of lukewarm water thing, right? If you're doing a sentence or two on all of this stuff, but really not hitting powerfully any of it, it's actually going to be boring. But if you're highlighting some really fascinating things, it's great. So you can have religion. What do people worship? How do they worship? What's interesting about it? You can have government. What type of government is there? How is it different from ours? What is unique about it? Do a few of these things, and you'll get a lot more mileage out of your time spent world building than if you try to do a little bit about each